The wind scraped at the door like it held a grudge. It rattled the warped frame and whistled through the gaps in the boards, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and far-off rain. Inside, Silas Boone sat hunched at the wooden table, a chipped mug of coffee cooling in his hand. He didn't drink it. He rarely did. It was the ritual, not the warmth, that he clung to now. Outside, the prairie stretched in every direction, brittle and endless, a sea of gold turned to ash by time. Fences ran crooked along the horizon, and beyond them, the hills rolled like the backs of sleeping beasts. Nothing stirred, not the horse in the paddock, not the weathered rooster on the porch rail, not even old June, his cow, whose breath steamed gently in the early cold. It was a kind of quiet that had weight to it, pressing down on the bones. Silas hadn't spoken in 20 years. Not a word, not even to himself. Not since they buried her, Annabelle, in the orchard beneath the lilac tree that hadn't bloomed since. The silence had grown roots in him, wrapping around his ribs and lungs, turning his voice to stone. He didn't mind. Words hadn't saved her. Words hadn't changed a damn thing. He rose with a stiffness that betrayed the years, pulled on his coat, and stepped out into the wind. It caught his hat and tugged at his sleeves, but he moved through it like someone underwater. Slow, heavy, used the resistance. He crossed the yard, unlatching the barn door with practiced hand. Old June lowered a greeting, or perhaps a complaint. Her eyes, cloudy with age, tracked him with familiar suspicion. He moved with care. Everything with her required gentleness now. Her legs stiff with arthritis. Her back bowed like a ship's hull. He laid the pail beneath her and ran his hands along her side. The sound of milk hitting metal was the only music this place knew anymore. The knock came like a misstep in a familiar dance, sharp, uncertain, and impossibly human. Silas froze, the rhythm broken. He turned, half expecting the wind again, a shutter banging loose. But the knock came once more, timid but real. He stepped out from the barn, boots crunching gravel. She stood at the gate, barely more than a girl, though the hard miles on her face made her seem older. Dust clung to her braid, and her boots were cracked at the soles. In her hands, she clutched a worn notebook, the corners chewed, the cover sun-faded. "I heard you know cows," she said, her voice steadier than her hands. "I was wondering if you could show me how to milk one." He said nothing. The wind played with the hem of her coat. Her gaze didn't waver, though something behind it flickered, doubt or pride, or both. He looked at her for a long moment, then turned and walked back to the barn. He left the door open. She hesitated, then followed. Inside, the light was soft and amber, slanting through gaps in the wood. Dust swirled lazily in the beams. Silas moved to the stool and stepped aside. She watched him with guarded eyes, then knelt beside old June, careful and slow. The cow flicked her tail but didn't spook. "Never done this," the girl murmured. "Only read about it." Silas didn't respond. He watched as she tried. Awkward, hesitant, her hands too gentle, then too firm. Milk sputtered, missed the pail. June shifted her weight, unimpressed. He reached out, slowly, no warning, and guided her hands. His fingers closed over hers, steadying, adjusting, releasing. She looked at him then, really looked, as if trying to read a language written on his face. "I'm Clara," she said. He didn't blink. "You don't talk, do you?" Still nothing. Clara gave a breath of something like amusement. "That's all right. Most folks who talk too much don't say anything worth hearing." She tried again. This time, the milk flowed clean and true, striking the pail with rhythm almost peaceful. A smile touched her lips, brief and real. For a while, neither of them moved. The air smelled of hay, warm earth, and something older, something like memory. When the pail was nearly full, Clara sat back on her heels. Her hands were red and shaking slightly. "Thank you," she said, softer now. Silas turned away and busied himself with the bridle hanging from the wall. "I ain't staying long," she added, perhaps to fill the silence. "Just passing through, looking for work, or something like it." He glanced at her then, but only briefly. She stood, brushing off her knees. "You've got a good cow, temperamental but sweet underneath." That almost earned a smirk from Silas. She lingered at the barn door. "I'll be back tomorrow. If that's all right, I'll bring my own pail." He didn't nod, didn't wave, but he didn't shut the door behind her either. After she left, he sat on the stool and stared at the place she'd knelt. The silence returned, but it felt thinner now, less certain of itself. That night, Silas didn't sleep. He lay on the bed that had once held two, the mattress sunken on one side, and stared at the ceiling while the wind dragged its nails across the walls. In the morning, he rose before the sun, made 2 mugs of coffee, left one on the fence post where Clara had stood. She came, didn't mention the cup, just picked it up, drank, and said, "Ready?" They milked in silence. But something had shifted, an invisible thread pulling taut between them. She didn't fumble this time. Her hands moved with memory, not confidence, but the beginning of it. "Why don't you talk?" she asked, not expecting an answer. Silas didn't look up. "I think people say too much, anyway. Words can twist things, make something simple feel complicated." She leaned back against the barn wall, the pail warm between her boots. "Sometimes I think the world's just waiting for someone to listen to it." He almost spoke then. Something moved behind his eyes, a spark beneath the ash, but it passed. As Clara stood to leave, she paused. "I heard your wife died. I'm sorry." The barn seemed to still. Clara shifted, suddenly self-conscious. "I didn't mean to pry. Just folks in town talk." Silas's hand gripped the doorframe. His knuckles turned white, but he didn't shut the door behind her. Outside, the sun was breaking through the clouds, painting the prairie in long, golden slashes. Clara walked toward the fence, her braids swinging gently with each step. She didn't look back. Silas turned to old June, who chewed thoughtfully, indifferent to the thunder rolling on the horizon. But it wasn't thunder. It was a sound of hooves, riders coming fast. And they weren't from town. The morning rode in on a hush, as if the prairie held its breath. Mist clung low to the earth, silvering the corral fence and curling around the legs of old June like a tired ghost. Silas Boone moved through it with deliberate care, each step worn into ritual, each breath thick with memory. The coffee on the fence post steamed quietly beside a second mug, already cooling. He didn't look toward the road. He never did, but he always poured 2 cups now. The gate creaked. He heard her boots before he saw her. Clara entered the yard with her braid tucked beneath a bandana, cheeks wind-burned, eyes alert. She walked like someone who'd learned not to flinch, shoulders squared against whatever might come next. She didn't speak. She just took the cup, drank without pause, then nodded toward the barn. He led the way. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of straw and old sweat. Sunlight fractured through the slats, catching the dust in slow motion. Old June was already waiting. Her bulk settled into the shadows like a boulder. Clara dropped to her knees beside the pail, hands already positioned with surprising grace. She didn't ask for help now. She didn't need to. They fell into rhythm, milk hitting metal, birdsong filtering through cracks, the occasional flick of June's tail. No words passed between them, but something else did, thick as fog, steady as breath. Trust, maybe, or the beginnings of it. When the chore was done, Clara rose and wiped her palms on her jeans. "I can fix that hinge on the barn door," she said. "It drags left." Silas didn't answer, but his eyes flicked to the toolbox on the shelf. She retrieved it without waiting. For the next hour, they moved side by side. She oiled hinges, patched chicken wire, stacked feed sacks. He watched her, not as a man studies a stranger, but as a farmer watches weather, assessing, respectful. "You don't seem surprised I keep coming back," Clara said, pausing with a hammer in hand. Silas didn't shrug, just shifted a rusted nail between his fingers, held it like a question he wouldn't ask. "I guess you think I'm stubborn," she said, brushing dirt from her sleeve. "Or desperate. Maybe I am." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't ask her to. But later, when she passed him on her way out, he reached into the back of the wagon and pulled out a small tin of salve, something homemade, smelling faintly of eucalyptus and lye. He held it out, for her hands. She stared at it for a beat, then took it. No thanks. No smile. Just a quiet exchange of 2 people who didn't need explanations. By the fifth morning, the second cup of coffee was warm when she arrived. She noticed, didn't comment, just sipped slower. Silas caught her humming once, barely audible, a thread of melody that disappeared as soon as he looked up. It reminded him of the way Annabelle used to hum while kneading bread. Her sleeves rolled to the elbow, flowers smudged across her chin. He turned away before the memory could finish blooming. That day, Clara stayed past noon. She sat on the porch, mending a saddle strap, the sun painting stripes across her lap. Silas worked on the fencing nearby, the sound of hammer on post filling the air like a heartbeat. Eventually, she said, I used to ride with my pa long drives, weeks out on the trail. He'd tell stories at night, mostly lies, but the kind that made you feel warm. Silas paused mid-swing. Waited. He died last year. Left me a saddle and a bad reputation for talking back. She didn't look at him when she said it. He set the hammer down gently and walked back toward the barn. Later, when she returned to her horse, she found a polished horseshoe nailed to her saddle horn. A small gesture, but freshly done, intentional. That week, whispers stirred in town. Sheriff Briggs came riding up one afternoon, saddle creaking, sweat darkening his collar. He dismounted with the self-importance of a man who carried a badge and believed it outweighed truth. Heard you got company, Boone, he said, gaze shifting toward the barn where Clara's laughter had just echoed. Young woman. Strange sort. Town folks say she's too familiar. Silas said nothing, just leaned against the post and watched the sheriff with eyes the color of overcast sky. Briggs spat. You've got a past, I get it, but appearances matter. Folks talk. A man like you, living alone, a girl like her, it ain't right. Silas's jaw tightened. He bent, picked up a piece of rope, and resumed coiling it with quiet precision. The sheriff stood there another minute, clearly waiting for a reply. When none came, he mounted his horse and muttered, Suit yourself, but don't say you weren't warned. The next day, Clara found Silas hammering in the paddock. She approached slower than usual, a strange look in her eyes. I know what they're saying, she said. He didn't respond. I don't care. Still silence. But I need to know if you do. He stopped, looked at her, really looked. Her hands were cracked, her eyes tired, but her spine held straight, defiant in the wind. He turned away, walked toward the barn. She thought he was retreating, that maybe the sheriff's words had landed after all. But when she entered the barn, she saw it. A second stool, polished and waiting, placed beside June's stall. A new pail, too, smaller, fitted to her grip. A gesture not of possession, but partnership. She didn't speak, just sat down and began to work, breath sinking with the cows. Silas leaned in the doorway, arms folded. The silence between them felt warm this time, less like absence, more like shelter. When the job was done, she stood and turned to leave, but Silas stepped forward. He held something in his palm. A thin leather strap, looped and tied in a simple knot. Not new, not fancy, but carefully made. Her name etched faintly on the inside. She stared, then took it. She looped it through her braid that night. No mirror, no need. The next morning, she arrived before dawn, and with her came another knock. But this time it wasn't hers. This knock was harder, and it didn't stop. The knocking came again, harder this time, a sharp rhythm that rattled the air like distant thunder. Silas froze halfway to the stove. Clara just behind her with her hand still smelling of soap and raw milk. Morning hadn't yet cracked fully over the prairie, and the mist outside the window looked thick enough to drown in. He didn't move at first, just stood there, staring at the door as if trying to decide whether this knock was real or something summoned from the long silence that lived inside him. Clara stepped forward, but he raised a hand, stopping her gently. The knock came again, insistent. When he opened the door, Sheriff Ellery Briggs stood on the porch, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. Two townsfolk behind him, Martha Deeks and her husband, Judd. All three had the look of people not used to being ignored. Briggs tipped his hat, eyes scanning the scene behind Silas. Mornin', Boone. Sorry to come uninvited, but folks are worried. Silas didn't reply. Clara stood near the hearth, shoulders back, chin lifted. She didn't try to hide. Briggs gestured vaguely toward her. Young lady's been seen here near daily. Town's begun to speculate. Martha here thinks it's improper. Judd says there's talk. Clara crossed her arms, voice steady. There's always talk, whether you earn it or not. Martha flinched like she'd been slapped. Briggs cleared his throat. No one's accusing anyone. But questions hang heavy, Boone, and silence doesn't answer him. Still, Silas said nothing. I'd hate for something honest to be misread, Briggs added, trying for gentle but landing just north of smug. The moment hung taut, air thick and bitter. Then Silas turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door open. Clara followed, confusion flickering in her gaze. Briggs hesitated, then stepped onto the porch, but stopped short of entering. In the barn later, neither of them spoke. They milked old June like always, but the piece was thinner, cracked around the edges. Clara's movements were stiff, her brow creased. Silas watched her hands, noticed a small tremble in them, the one she'd learned to hide. When she finished, she stood and wiped her palms on her jeans, then looked at him square. Do you want me to stop coming? He met her gaze, the question hanging between them like smoke. I won't stay where I'm not wanted, she said, voice even. I've done that before. His hands tightened around the pail, knuckles pale. Still, he said nothing. But something behind his eyes flickered, an old wound reopening, or maybe an answer unspoken. Then, as if summoned by their silence, the sky split open with a deep, rolling growl. Wind howled through the boards. A storm was coming. They barely had time to secure the barn doors before the rain fell hard and slanting, hammering the roof, turning dirt to mire. From the corral came the sharp cry of panic. Old June, agitated, her hooves slipping in the churned mud. Clara bolted into the storm before Silas could stop her, coat flapping, braid trailing like a broken rope. He shouted, instinct, not habit, and ran after her. The cow had broken the gate, blind panic driving her into the open. Clara was already in the pasture, boots half sinking, trying to corral the massive creature back toward shelter. Clara! Silas's voice cracked the sky, ragged from disuse, startling even himself. She turned toward him, just as June bucked sideways, hooves flailing. Clara slipped. He was beside her in an instant, arms catching her weight as she collapsed, blood trickling from her temple where she'd struck a rock. She blinked, dazed, and reached for him. You spoke, she murmured like a secret. He didn't answer, just scooped her into his arms, cradling her like something too fragile for the world. Rain soaked through his coat, her hair heavy against his chest. The wind screamed, but he moved through it with the purpose of a man who no longer feared being heard. Back inside, he laid her on the cot, lit the lantern with trembling fingers. She stirred as he cleaned the cut, her eyes fluttering open with soft resistance. You're all right, he whispered, the second word he'd spoken aloud in 2 decades. Her hand caught his. You don't have to be silent anymore, she said. Not with me. He didn't nod, didn't smile, but he stayed at her side until the storm passed, until the thunder faded into distant sighs. Morning came slow and gentle. The air smelled of wet soil and eucalyptus. Clara slept on the cot, her breathing steady. Color returned to her cheeks. Silas sat near the stove, staring at his own hands as if trying to recognize them. A soft knock tapped against the door. This time, it wasn't the sheriff. It was Martha Deeks, alone, hat clutched in her hands, eyes rimmed red. She didn't look angry. She looked apologetic. I came to say I was wrong, she said before he could speak. You saved that girl's life. And I remembered something I'd rather forget, that your wife was my friend once. And I didn't stand up for her, either. She set a small bundle on the step, fresh bread wrapped in linen. For both of you. He nodded just once. When he returned inside, Clara was sitting up, rubbing her temple, her eyes still sleepy. We're talk of the town, aren't we? She said dryly. He crossed to the table, poured coffee into 2 chip mugs, and handed one to her. You care? He asked, voice rasping like wind through brittle grass. She took the cup. Only if you do. He looked at her a long moment, then said, I did, once. She smiled softly. Then, don't again. They drank in silence, but this silence was different. Not absence, not pain, just the kind of quiet you earn, not the kind you flee. Outside, the prairie glistened wash clean. The storm had left the sky clear, the air bright, the fence mended. A bird landed on the gatepost and sang like it had something to prove. And inside, two people shared a warmth no one could name, not out loud. But on the ridge just beyond the trees, another figure waited, hat low, coat dark, horse restless, watching,